Good afternoon. I'm Marcia Torvin. I'd like to welcome you to our program this afternoon from Superman to Spiegelman, Comics and a Graphic Novel, with Dr. Laurence Roth, and we're also going to be showing the documentary, The Art of Spiegelman. But before I introduce our guests, just a couple of things. I wanted to extend, this will be our final thanks to Bonnie Ellinger and Paul Golding, who are one of our sponsors, and an extra thanks to Bonnie, whose idea was actually to do a literary festival. This is our closing event. We had 13 a combination of films and talks, 13 events over 6 weeks, and this is our final one. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Laurence Roth. He is the Professor Charles B. Degenstein Professor of English. He's the co-chair of the Department of English and Creative Writing at Susquehanna University. He's also the Director of Jewish and Israel Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Laurence Roth.
Thank you for that very lovely introduction. You'll see that the title actually inverts the title that you saw from Superman and Spiegelman. There's a reason for that. I'm trying to make a point, and I think you'll see what that is by the time I'm done. I want to begin, though, with an origin story. Origin stories in comic books are how superheroes are explained to their audiences, how they got their powers, and how they came to be the superheroes they are. My origin story is how I came to study and write about comic books. I wasn't allowed to read comic books as a kid. I only discovered them across the street at my best friend's house, where I found and read his Spider-Man and Sergeant Rock comic books. I was utterly unaware of who Stan Lee and Joe Kubert were, the creators of those series, along with Steve Ditko and Robert Kanigher, much less that those two were Jewish like me. My dad owned a Jewish bookstore. That's it right there. It was in Los Angeles, J. Roth Bookseller of Fine and Scholarly Judaica, and this was at the grand opening in 1979 when he moved from La Cienega to Pico Boulevard, 9427 West Pico Boulevard. That's my brother playing violin in the middle there. And that fellow all the way on the right, that's me with a whole lot more hair. So my dad was old school, as they'd say today. Comic books were junk reading, and we weren't allowed to buy them, we weren't allowed to read them. Sure, he sold the anthology of Yaakov Kirshen's Dry Bones comic strip, which appeared in the Jerusalem Post in the 1970s, and he carried Torah Umasora's Olamenu, which was a magazine for young Orthodox readers that regularly featured short comic strips about famous rabbis on the back cover. But Marvel and DC Comics, dreck. So I paid almost no attention to comics until Art Spiegelman's Mouse 1 appeared as a book in 1986. Like everyone else, I was both surprised and intrigued. What was this? What did it mean? A Holocaust story drawn with mice and cats and pigs? Who was this guy? For my dad, the questions were a little different. In what section of the store should he stock this? Who in the world was going to buy this? As it turned out, the book sold well. And those are the two up there, right? Though my father regularly moved it around his store. First, the new book table, then the gift book table, then the history and Holocaust section, and once even in the art book section. Just had no idea where to put it. By 1991, I was in graduate school and working part-time, both at my dad's bookstore and up on the Sunset Strip in an independent bookstore called Book Soup. Mouse 2 was finally being published, and Spiegelman was being brought to LA by the publisher Pantheon Books to do book signings. I told my father he had to get Spiegelman to do a signing, and I convinced the publisher's rep that since Mouse was a Jewish book, my dad ought to have the signing before Book Soup did. Incredibly, Pantheon agreed. My father didn't have a lot of book signings at his store. Mostly, the authors who talked him into it were local, and a signing usually consisted of the author's friends coming by for a free schnosh, to schmooze a little, and to congratulate the author on his new book. My father scheduled Spiegelman's signing in the evening. We closed the store to go to dinner and planned to come back, open up, meet Spiegelman, do the event. After dinner, as I drove up to the store, we saw a line of people stretching all the way down the block, waiting for the doors to open. "Wow," my father exclaimed, "he must have a lot of friends." Back in grad school, I discovered that Spiegelman was part of an important group of alternative comics artists who were part of or inspired by the underground comics of the 1960s and 1970s. And a lot of these you're going to be able to see outside, so I'm really thankful for that. Robert Crumb, who did Fritz the Cat up there, Gilbert Shelton, famous for the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, Kim Deitch, that's his character Waldo, Trina Robbins, Aileen Kaminsky, Sharon Rudolph, Harvey Pekar, among many others. I also discovered that Robbins, Kaminsky, Rudolph, and Pekar were not only Jewish, but had also produced work that commented on their identity or on contemporary Jewish American culture. So Robbins and Rudolph founded Women's Comics in 1972. That's it up there. Kaminsky founded Twisted Sisters in 1976 and married R. Crumb 2 years later. And you can see that's her actually on the cover of Twisted Sisters. And then also Sharon Rudolph, The Star Sapphire, great story about a young Jewish woman who marries a non-Jewish man, doesn't end very well. Harvey Pekar, American Splendor. But I also discovered Frank Miller's Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, and Alan Moore's and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen. In the 1980s, these remade the image of the comic book superhero, recasting them as fallible characters trying to do their best in politically dark and narratively complex stories. "Hey," a friend said to me, "did you know that Bill Finger and Bob Kane, who created Batman, were Jewish? And that most of the guys who invented superheroes and built the comic book business in the 1930s were Jewish too?" No, I didn't. But in the mid to late 90s, it seemed a lot of journalists, critics, and scholars were just discovering that too. In fact, because the rediscovery of the Jewish contribution to comic books and graphic novels happened during my generation's coming of age, what I'm trying to point out here is the way that Spiegelman's mouse inspired so many of us to go back and take a look at the Jewish writers and artists who made them, and to wonder how their comic books made the transition from newsstands and drugstore spinner racks to dedicated comic book stores, to Barnes and Nobles and Borders, and even here and there into Jewish bookstores like my father's, where Jewish American comic books and graphic novels became a subject category, and so a purchasable item. We helped create that category. Now, just as important as Spiegelman to this rediscovery, though, was Will Eisner, who at the same time that Spiegelman was creating Mouse was himself writing a series of books. A Contract with God in 1978, A Life Force in 1988, To the Heart of the Storm, 1991, and Dropsy Avenue, The Neighborhood in 1995. These were all based on his life growing up Jewish in the Bronx during the Depression, and telling the story of how he became one of the premier writer-artists of the golden age of comic books, which is the period 1938 to 1953, roughly. So Eisner was best known for creating The Spirit, which was this dapper, night-stalking masked detective who made Eisner famous in the early 1940s. He's kind of like Batman, but he doesn't have a whole outfit, just the mask that he has, which means that he doesn't have like superpowers like Superman. He's a regular guy, but with a really, really sharp sense of right and wrong, and of course, very strong. After retiring The Spirit in 1952, Eisner dropped out of the comics world and turned to educational and commercial illustration work. But in 1972, as he recounted in an essay in the New York Times Book Review, he attended his first comic book convention, and he said this, quote, "I met the new breed of comic cartoonists for the first time. Long-haired, wild-eyed, and intense, they spoke the language of comics. It was a language that gave voice to their protest and social ideas. I wanted to be part of the excitement again." So inspired by all those folks that I showed you a moment ago, Eisner wrote the 4 books that comprised his Bronx cycle, calling them graphic novels. Eisner wasn't the first to use graphic novel to describe comic books that employ the narrative strategies and character development of literary fiction. But this new mode of popular literature provided just the right vehicle with which to tell stories about the world of his youth. a world of hard work, limited horizons, frequent catastrophes, and socially acceptable anti-Semitism. Eisner showed how the language of comics art, of sequential art, as he called it, could give voice to the lessons he learned as a young man, the most important of which was, quote, how little control we have over human destiny, despite our technology and innovation. As Forgotten Judaism, Eisner said in an interview that, quote, most religions I'm familiar with assure us that there exists a compact between man and deity under which each has certain obligations. Well, so far, I have yet to be convinced that both parties have truly lived up to and delivered on this agreement. So through his unique yoking of subject matter to form, Eisner seemed to argue that to survive in America's ever-changing open market, both comic books and Jews must engage a larger project of aesthetic, cultural, religious, and social renegotiation and redevelopment. In other words, each had to remake themselves for a new era. To those of us analyzing their works, Eisner and Spiegelman were clearly the major figures who treated comic books as a means to document and to question the construction of Jewish identity in comic books and in America. As the scholar Michael Rothberg points out, by literally revisualizing the Jewish immigrant story and the traumas of the Holocaust, both artists helped us to see the issues that are at stake for that identity. So what a Jewish body looks like, literally, in a comic book, but also in the world at large. How Jews lack or wield power, whether they can be superheroes or whether they're the victims of violence. And how the Holocaust is inevitably bound up in both scholarly and popular understandings of Zionism and Jewish national self-determination. In fact, these became precisely the topics and concerns that defined American Jewish comic books and graphic novels in the first decades of the new millennium. Not surprisingly, Jewish scholars and critics dove into the archives to reconsider the contributions of other and earlier Jewish comics artists to these topics. So they rediscovered strip creators such as Milt Gross, Rube Goldberg, Al Capp, and Hilda Terry. Eisner's fellow comic book creators such as Bob Kane, born Robert Kahn, Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg, Joe Kubert, who was actually born Joseph Kubert, and Stan Lee, who was actually born Stanley Lieber. They also rediscovered Harvey Kurtzman, the creator of the seminal humor comic Mad Magazine, and of course his editors, Al Jaffe, Al Feldstein, and Bill Drucker. And they found, they didn't have to work too hard to find these folks because they were really out in the newspapers. Jules Pfeiffer and political cartoonists such as Herbert L. Bloch and New Yorker cartoonists such as Saul Steinberg, William Steig, Roz Chast, who still does fabulous stuff, and Bruce Eric Kaplan. But most of all, everyone started taking another look at issue number 1 of Action Comics, which is the first appearance in 1938 of Jerry Siegel's and Joe Shusterman's Superman. Like Eisner, Siegel, and Shuster were two Depression-era kids, but they grew up in Cleveland's bustling Jewish community in the Glenville neighborhood. Always the nerdy outsiders, Siegel was the writer whose father was murdered in the clothing store he owned, and Shuster was the nearsighted illustrator whose father was a struggling tailor in the rag trade. Both loved science fiction stories, the new comic strips like Dick Tracy, Buck Rogers, and Tarzan, and Hollywood gangster movies. So the question kind of arose. Did the first all-American superhero reflect some aspect of his creator's identities? Was Superman really a crypto-Jew, some sort of moron? Some kind of Jewish-American wish fulfillment? Are superheroes a Jewish invention? So these questions were given popular expression in this book, Michael Chabon's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which many of you might know, published back in 2000. Chabon's story of how Sammy Clay and his cousin Joseph Cavalier created The Escapist, a superhero comic book character modeled on Superman, Harry Houdini, and the Golem of Prague, helped explain how a generation of middle-class New York Jews, born around 1915, become key players in the creation of the comic book and the superhero comic. Throughout the novel, the cousins' education and sexual self-knowledge in the cutthroat economics of the American culture industries, and their emotional and spiritual crises are given material expression through the development and maturation of their art and of themselves as artists. A major result of that in the novel is Joseph's creation of a 2,256-page comic book titled The Golem, whose scope and psychological complexity becomes the fictional predecessor of the literary graphic novel. So what Chabon is doing there is fooling around with the idea that the folks who started comic books actually ended up creating something that we now know as the literary graphic novel. Chabon's novel also ignited mass audience interest in the work of Jewish comic artists from the Depression-era generation that were portrayed in it. And of course also in the ostensible Jewishness of comic book superheroes such as Superman, Spider-Man, The Thing, and other characters from Marvel and DC Comics. Suddenly, it seemed, a horde of journalists filed articles in American Jewish magazines and newspapers like Heap, the New Jew Review, citing amazing adventures in order to assert that, quote, superheroes are a surprising manifestation of the venerable Jewish tradition of repairing the world. Or that, quote, Superman actualized the adolescent power fantasies of its creators, and illustrates the connection between superheroes and the Golem of Prague. And that Chabon's novel and subsequent appearance of The Escapist as a real comic book series published by Dark Horse Comics, quote, references not only the appeal of escapism, but also comics as a medium suited for Jewish metamorphosis. And of course, this is the Jewish metamorphosis captured for a younger mass audience. These same journalists also structured their stories to underline the rise of graphic novels for, quote, mature audiences, and the importance of Spiegelman's mouse in, quote, demonstrating the graphic novels were an independent medium for telling personal stories. Like the journalists, many scholars too also praise the graphic novel as, quote, an art form. The comic book's full-form version, perhaps best known for its greater degree of literary sophistication and arguably aesthetic ambition. And therefore, as in Joseph Cavalier's example, the appropriate vehicle for graphic artists to explore Jewish self-fashioning and the ambiguities of Jewish visual representations. So together, what the journalists and scholars did was establish this recurrent theme, which goes like this. Comic books begin in the 1930s as adolescent Jewish American power fantasies. But thanks to the groundbreaking work of Eisner, Spiegelman, Robbins, Kaminsky-Crumb, Rudolph, Picard, and others, they've since grown up into a complex and sophisticated maturity, into graphic novels. So comic books for kids, graphic novels for adults. And you can tell by the way I'm talking that I really don't buy that. There are plenty of superhero comics that are very sophisticated and complex, and there are plenty of graphic novels that are pretty simplistic and bad. But what that theme did, and its real importance, was it placed Jews at the center of the inception and development of the comics industry. It lent Jewish identity renewed cultural legitimacy and social prestige, just as the highly contentious findings of the 1990 and 2000 National Jewish Population Surveys appeared. And they showed that young Jews were supposedly assimilating in record numbers. So Jewish American philanthropies and cultural outreach organizations consciously decided that Jewish American comic books and graphic novels were the perfect vehicles for and examples of how to engage young Jews in Jewish cultural renewal. And so as a result, exhibitions about Jews in comics quickly became standard fare at Jewish museums. But I should also point out that Heap, the New Jew Review, which looks so street, was in fact funded by the Bronfman Foundation. It was actually a way in which Jewish philanthropies thought that they could get young Jews. And I suppose that's pretty attractive, but also pretty funny at the same time. And so in a relatively short span of time, from roughly 1978 to the turn of the millennium, the subject category Jewish American comic books and graphic novels was materialized, taking shape in critical conversations among people like me and my colleagues, on bookstore and comic shop sales floors, and in museum exhibitions. And so I can assure you, before 1978, there was nothing like that in a Jewish bookstore. My dad had no section for comics or anything like that. So where are we now? Over the last 15 or so years, two distinct trends have arisen in the study and the expansion of Jewish comics. First, Jewish fans of superhero comics have written books that see all kinds of Jewish subtext in Golden and Silver Age superhero comic books. They claim to show all kinds of Jewish subtexts and all kinds of Jewish influence that's predicated on their creators' biographies, which is then reconstituted as a Jewish sensibility that reappears as hidden themes, tropes, or imagery in the comics themselves. It's kind of like, Where's Waldo? As you can tell by that as well, I don't really buy that either. But I find a book like Ari Kaplan's From Krakow to Krypton, Jews in Comic Books, which was written in 2008, really the most useful, and that's really a great book, because he reveals very specific information about the Jewish context of that work. So, for example, he showed that Jack Kirby kept an unpublished drawing of the Thing in full rabbinical garb in his house. And the picture shows the Thing wearing tefillin and a kippah and a talis. Right? So Jack Kirby really did think of the Thing as having some kind of connection to his Jewish life. And he also showed that Chris Claremont, who turned X-Men into a hit series featuring the supervillain Magneto, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, he found that he went on a trip to Israel to live on a kibbutz for 2 months, where he was deeply affected by a viewing of the film Judgment at Nuremberg. So looking at X-Men, you can really see that Chris Claremont wanted to incorporate something that he had experienced. And it's provable. We know he went there, we know he felt that that was something really important, and that he wanted to include into the X-Men character of Magneto. Also, non-Jews like Gerard Jones and my colleague and friend Mark Verteeg have written excellent books that explain the social context of the comic book industry in the 1930s. That Jews were already deeply involved in the gritty business of magazine distribution and marketing, which was somewhat run by the mob, actually. And also finding out that none of the prestige newspapers, magazines, or art societies who were governed by a genteel anti-Semitism would accept Jewish illustrators and artists. So to make a living, they had to make comic books. Verteeg just published a fabulous book on comic book covers, and if you're looking for a good Hanukkah gift, I highly recommend this. Really lovely reproductions of these comic book covers. It's called Take That, Adolf. And he explains in there that Martin Goodman, who is the editor of Timely Comics, which eventually becomes Marvel Comics through a kind of circuitous route, quote, believed strongly that comics could be used to sway the public against Nazism. And he asked Funnies Incorporated to supply Timely with stories that supported this editorial policy. So it's Timely, run by Goodman, that publishes the first and most famous cover of a superhero, Captain America, punching Hitler in the face, which was drawn by Jack Kirby, born Jacob Kurtzberg. And so that really reflects something that Goodman felt really strongly about, trying to show the American public that Hitler really was a danger, and that meant a lot to him. The second trend has been an explosion of fascinating and wide-ranging comic books and graphic novels that, on the one hand, extend the superhero genre into unexpected Jewish markets, and on the other hand, continue exploring the Jewish identity issues to which Spiegelman, Eisner, Kaminsky, Crumb, Rudall, and Picard gave voice and body. Given that I saw my father sell Orthodox Comics in his store, not just the Torah Umasora back cover stories, but also in the early 1980s, Lydell Estrin and David Sears independently published Mendy and the Golem. That was around, and I knew, having seen that there had to be others, there had to be more. And what I found was not just Al Weisner's self-published Shalom Man, which he did between 1988 and 2004, and Alan Orich's Jewish Hero Corps, which he did in 2003, which features Menorah Man, he's the guy talking, and Dreidel Girl, she's spinning down in the corner there. But an almost entirely ignored canon of comics for young Orthodox identified Jewish readers. Now, most of these were published by Eric Marr for his Marwood Press. Eric Marr was a Baal Tshuva, a returnee to the faith, who grew up in the U.S. and he was a fan of Silver Age comics, those comics from roughly 1956 to 1968, 69. When he was born again, when he became a Baal Tshuva, he brought his love of comics with him. And so he established Morrowood Press in 2004, and he led it until his untimely death in 2010. He helped to write, edit, and produce a series of comic books that combined rabbinic hagiography, in other words, stories about the sainted rabbis, with aspects of the superhero genres. They were superhero rabbis. And they featured haskamot, which are letters of approbation by religious authorities attesting to their religious merit and educational worthiness. In other words, Orthodox rabbis, ultra-Orthodox rabbis, approved these comics to be given out to kids in schools and to be sold to them. So what he wrote was these three, Shmuel HaNagid, Rambam, and Rashi HaKodesh. If you're thinking of getting any of these, Shmuel HaNagid is really the best. Rashi HaKodesh, not a very exciting story. Not that it couldn't have been, but it just didn't turn out that way. So consequently, a number of Orthodox-oriented Jewish American bookstores had to decide for the first time whether and where to place these books on their sales floor, though most opted to incorporate them either wholly or as a subcategory in their children's section. So today you'll find Orthodox Comics published by some of the most respected Orthodox Jewish publishers. If you're looking for them, Feldheim Publishers, if you go online, you can see a whole lot of them there. I believe they have the largest number, and that's available for purchase. In the mainstream and indie publishing world, Jewishly oriented graphic novels continue to find really passionate audiences. So as I said earlier, most of these continue to focus on the Jewish American immigrant past, the Holocaust, and Israel, precisely the three types of stories that also describe the mainstream of popular Jewish American fiction for mass audiences. The most celebrated examples here include the Holocaust-themed work of Joe Kubert, who wrote Yassel up there, Miriam Caton, Martin Lemelman, Bernice Eisenstein, and of course Spiegelman. The immigrant and acculturation-focused work of James Sturm, The Golden's Mighty Swing, has been very popular. Ben Katcher, Leila Corwin, Anya Ulinich, and Joanne Spar, who wrote The Rabbi's Cat. That's actually translated from the French. He's a French-Jewish writer, artist who explores Sephardic and European Jewish acculturation. But Rabbi's Cat has actually become a pretty important part of the conversation about Jewish American graphic novels. And of course, down here, the Israel-focused work of Miriam Lubicki, Sarah Glidden, and Rutu Modan. Rutu Modan is an Israeli writer-artist. She got her start in the Actus Tragicus Collective, which is an Israeli comic book group. And then she wrote this book and The Property, and they've become really important additions to the Jewish American literary scene as well. So all of these, of course, also would make great Hanukkah gifts. And finally, particularly welcome is the burgeoning genre of Jewish women's confessional comics that follow in the footsteps of Robbins, Kaminsky-Crumb, and Rudolph. Ariel Schrag, Vanessa Davis, and again, I can highly recommend that. So like a diary-type comic, but also a story of her own life and some of the adventures that she has in it. And Miss Lasco Gross, Escape from Special, are just some of the writer-artists who are included in the exhibition Graphic Details. Confessional Comics by Jewish Women, curated by Sarah Lightman and Michael Kaminer, that opened at Yeshiva University Museum in 2011. That was the first to focus long overdue attention on both established and emerging artists making these autobiographical comics. And you may have noticed on the previous page, like I said, Rutu Modan, Sarah Glidden, Miriam Lubicki, Leila Corwin, they too are part of some of these autobiographical comics artists. Well, for a kid who wasn't allowed to read comic books, I sure ended up spending a lot of my time in my adult life writing and thinking about them. Still, I wouldn't call myself a hardcore fan. Unlike my friend Mark Fertig, I don't have a dedicated room in my house just for my comic books. All my Jewish comic books fit into one long shelf in my office. Right in the middle is Art Spiegelman's mouse. As you'll see in tonight's documentary, he'll likely remain not just one of the great comic book creators of our time, but also, and importantly, one of the great Jewish writers of our time. Like the greats, his work changed what we talk about when we talk about Jewish literature. His comics suddenly demanded a whole new subject category, a place of its own in the canon that made space for others like him working in the same medium. That's certainly one mark of a major talent. But also this. My father continues to send me clippings from the newspaper, reporting on all the new Jewish comic book titles, an interview with a Jewish writer artist, or a new exhibition of Jewish American comic books and graphic novels. He's become something of a maven on the subject. So I like to think that had the store remained open, my father, the American Moichersforum, the American Jewish bookseller, would have had the largest comic book section of any Jewish bookstore in the country. Imagine all the new friends we'd find at that book signing. Thank you. Well, I'm very glad you enjoyed it.
No, it was the perfect way to introduce the film too. It's just great.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So you see, this is the Betty Boop, and you see it's $1.
Right.
Betty Boop number 1.
So that's like 70 something, right?
Yeah, I think it's yes, it's 70 something. I'm not sure the date. Just like this says 1946, but it's really 70.
I saw that. That is a really cool spirit comic.
That is a very nice one.